Section 37 of Within a Budding Grove by Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kristen Hand. Section 37, Seascape with Frieze of Girls, Part 4. On our way back to Baalbec, of those of the fair strangers to whom he had introduced me, I would repeat to myself without a moment's interruption, and yet almost unconsciously, what a delightful woman, as one chimes in with the refrain of a song. I admit that these words were prompted rather by the state of my nerves than by any lasting judgment. It was nevertheless true that if I had had 1,000 francs on me, and if there had still been a jeweler's shop open at that hour, I should have bought the lady a ring. When the successive hours of our life are thus displayed against two widely dissimilar backgrounds, we find that we give away too much of ourselves to all sorts of people who next day will not interest us in the least. But we feel that we are still responsible for what we said to them overnight, and that we must honor our promises. As on these evenings I came back later than usual to the hotel, it was with joy that I recognized, in a room no longer hostile, the bed on which, on the day of my arrival, I had supposed that it would always be impossible for me to find any rest, whereas now my weary limbs turned to it for support, so that in turn thighs, hips, shoulders burrowed into, trying to adhere at every angle to the sheets that covered its mattress, as if my fatigue, like a sculptor, had wished to take a cast of an entire human body. But I could not go to sleep. I felt the approach of morning. Peace of mind, health of body were no longer mine. In my distress it seemed that never should I recapture them. I should have had to sleep for a long time if I were to overtake them. But then, had I begun to doze, I must in any event be awakened in a couple hours by the symphonic concert on the beach. Suddenly I was asleep. I had fallen into that deep slumber in which are opened to us a return to childhood, the recapture of past years, of lost feelings, the disincarnation, the transmigration of the soul, the evoking of the dead, the illusions of madness, retrogression towards the most elementary of the natural kingdoms. For we say that we often see animals in our dreams, but we forget almost always that we are ourself then an animal deprived of that reasoning power which projects upon things the light of certainty. We present, on the contrary, to the spectacle of life only a dubious vision, destroyed afresh every moment by oblivion, the former reality fading before that which follows it as one projection of a magic lantern fades before the next as we change the slide. All those mysteries which we imagine ourselves not to know, and into which we are in reality initiated almost every night, as we are going into the other great mystery of annihilation and resurrection. Rendered more vagabond by the difficulty of digesting my Rivebelle dinner, the successive and flickering illumination of shadowy zones of my past made of me a being whose supreme happiness would have been that of meeting Legrandine, with whom I had just been talking in my dream. And then, even my own life was entirely hidden from me by a new setting, like the drop lowered right at the front of the stage, before which, while the scene shifters are busy behind, the actors appear in a fresh turn. The turn in which I was now cast for a part was in the matter of an Oriental fairy tale. I retained no knowledge of my past or of myself, on account of the intense proximity of this interpolated scenery. I was merely a person who received the bastinado and underwent various punishments for a crime the nature of which I could not distinguish, though it was actually that of having taken too much port wine. Suddenly I awoke and discovered that, thanks to a long sleep, I had not heard a note of the concert. It was already afternoon. I verified this by my watch after several efforts to sit up in bed, efforts fruitless at first and interrupted by backward falls on to my pillow, but those short falls which are a sequel of sleep as of other forms of intoxication, whether due to wine or to convalescence. Besides, before I had so much as looked at the time, I was certain that it was past midday. Last night I had been nothing more than an empty vessel without weight, and, since I must first have gone to bed to be able to keep still, and have been asleep to be able to keep silent, had been unable to refrain from moving about and talking. I had no longer any stability, any center of gravity. I was set in motion, and it seems that I might have continued on my dreary course until I reached the moon. But if, while I slept, my eyes had not seen the time, my body had nevertheless contrived to calculate it, had measured the hours, not on a dial superficially marked and figured, but by the steadily growing weight of all my replenished forces, which, like a powerful clockwork, it had allowed, notch by notch, to descend from my brain into the rest of my body, in which there had risen now to above my knees the unbroken abundance of their store. If it is true that the sea was once upon a time our native element, into which we must plunge our cooling blood if we are to recover our strength, it is the same with the oblivion, the mental non-existence of. We seem then to absent ourselves for a few hours from time. But the forces which we have gathered in that interval without expending them, measure it by their quantity as accurately as the pendulum of the clock or the crumbling pyramid of the sand-glass. Nor does one emerge more easily from such sleep than from a prolonged spell of wakefulness, so strongly does everything tend to persist. And if it is true that certain narcotics will make us sleep, to have slept for any time is an even stronger narcotic, after which we have great difficulty in making ourselves wake up. Like a sailor who plainly sees the harbor in which he can moor his vessel, still tossed by the waves, I had a quite definite idea of looking at the time and of getting up, but my body was at every moment cast back upon the tide of sleep. The landing was difficult, and before I attained a position in which I could reach my watch and confront with its time that indicated by the wealth of accumulated material which my stiffened limbs had at their disposal, I fell back 2 or 3 times more upon my pillow. At length I could reach and read it. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I rang. But at once I returned to a slumber, which this time must have lasted infinitely longer, if I was to judge by the refreshment, the vision of an immense night overpast, which I found on awakening. And yet, as my awakening was caused by the entry of Francois, and as her entry had been prompted by my ringing the bell, this second sleep, which it seemed to me must have been longer than the other, had brought me so much comfort and forgetfulness, could not have lasted for more than half a minute. My grandmother opened the door of my bedroom. I asked her various questions about the Legrandin family. It is not enough to say that I had returned to tranquillity and health, for it was more than a mere interval of space that had divided them from me yesterday. I had had all night long to struggle against a contrary tide, and now I not only found myself again in their presence, they had once more entered into me. A certain definite and still somewhat painful points beneath the surface of my empty head, which would one day be broken, letting my ideas escape for all time. Those ideas had once again taken their proper places and resumed that existence by which hitherto, alas, they had failed to profit. Once again I had escaped from the impossibility of sleeping, from the deluge, the shipwreck of my nervous storms. I feared now not all the menaces that had loomed over me the evening before, when I was dismantled of repose. A new life was opening before me, without making a single movement, for I was still shattered, although quite alert and well. I savored my weariness with a light heart. It had isolated and broken asunder the bones of my legs and arms, which I could feel assembled before me, ready to cleave together, and which I was to raise to life merely by singing, like the builder in the fable. Suddenly I thought of the fair girl with the sad expression whom I had seen at Rivebelle, where she had looked at me for a moment. Many others, in the course of the evening, had seemed to me attractive. Now she alone arose from the dark places of my memory. I had felt that she noticed me, had expected one of the waiters to come to me with a whispered message from her. Saint-Loup did not know her, and fancied that she was respectable. It would be very difficult to see her constantly, but I was prepared to make any sacrifice. I thought now only of her. Philosophy distinguishes often between free and necessary acts. Perhaps there is none to the necessity of which we are more completely subjected than that which, by virtue of an ascending power held in check during the act itself, makes so unfailingly, once our mind is at rest, spring up a memory that was leveled with other memories by the distributed pressure of our indifference, and rush to the surface, because unknown to us it contained, more than any of the others, a charm of which we do not become aware until the following day. And perhaps there is not either any act so free, for it is still unprompted by habit, by that sort of mental hallucination, which when we are in love, facilitates the invariable reappearance of the image of one particular person. This was the day immediately following that on which I had seen file past me against a background of sea the beautiful procession of young girls. I put questions about them to a number of the visitors in the hotel, people who came almost every year to Baalbec. They could tell me nothing. Later on, a photograph showed me why. Who could ever recognize now in them, scarcely and yet quite definitely, beyond an age in which one changes so utterly, that amorphous, delicious mass, still wholly infantine, of little girls who only a few years back might have been sitting in a ring on the sand round a tent, a sort of white and vague constellation in which one would have distinguished a pair of eyes that sparkled more than the rest, a mischievous face, flaxen hair, only to lose them again and to confound them almost at once in the indistinct and milky nebula. No doubt, in those earlier years that were still so recent, it was not, as it had been yesterday when they appeared for the first time before me, one's impression of the group, but the group itself that had been lacking in clearness. Then those children, mere babies, had been still at that elementary stage in their formation when personality has not set its seal on every face. Like those primitive organisms in which the individual barely exists by itself, consists in the reef rather than in the coral insects that compose it, they were still pressed one against another. Sometimes one pushed her neighbor over, and then a wild laugh, which seemed the sole manifestation of their personal life, convulsed them all at once, obliterating, confounding those indefinite, grinning faces in the congealment of a single cluster, scintillating and tremulous. In an old photograph of themselves, which they were one day to give me, and which I have kept ever since, their infantile troop already presents the same number of participants as later their feminine procession. One can see from it that their presence must, even then, have made on the beach an unusual mark which forced itself on the attention, but one cannot recognize them individually in it save by a process of reasoning, leaving a clear field to all the transformations possible during girlhood, up to the point at which one reconstructed form would begin to encroach upon another individuality, which must be identified also, and whose handsome face, owing to the accessories of a large build and curly hair, may quite possibly have been, once, that wizened and impish little grin which the photograph album presents to us. And the distance traversed in a short interval of time by the physical characteristics of each of these girls making of them a criterion too vague to be of any use, whereas what they had in common, and, so to speak, collectively, had at that early date been strongly marked. It sometimes happened that even their most intimate friends mistook one for another in this photograph, so much so that the question could in the last resort be settled only by some detail of costume, which one of them could be certain that she herself and not any of the others had worn. Since those days, so different from the day on which I had just seen them strolling along the front, so different and yet so close in time, they still give way to fits of laughter, as I had observed that afternoon, but to a laughter of a kind that was no longer the intermittent and almost automatic laughter of childhood, a spasmodic discharge which in those days had continually set their heads dipping out of the circle, as the clusters of minnows in the Vivonne used to scatter and vanish only to gather again a moment later. Each countenance was now mistress of itself. Their eyes were fixed on the goal towards which they were marching, and it had taken, yesterday, the indecision and tremulousness of my first impression to make me confuse vaguely, as their childish hilarity in the old photograph had confused, the spores now individualized and disjoined of the pale madrepore. Repeatedly, I dare say, when pretty girls went by, I had promised myself that I would see them again. As a rule, people do not appear a second time. Moreover, our memory, which speedily forgets their existence, would find it difficult to recall their appearance. Our eyes would not recognize them, perhaps, and in the meantime we have seen new girls go by, whom we shall not see again either. But at other times, and this was what was to happen with the pert little band at Baalbec, chance brings them back insistently before our eyes. Chance seems to us then a good and useful thing, for we discern in it, as it were, rudiments of organization, of an attempt to arrange our life, and it makes easy to us, inevitable, and sometimes, after interruptions that have made us hope that we may cease to remember, cruel, the retention in our minds of images to the possession of which we shall come in time to believe that we were predestined, and which but for chance we should from the very first have managed to forget, like so many others, with so little difficulty. Presently St. Luc's visit drew to an end. I had not seen that party of girls again on the beach. He was too little at Baalbek in the afternoons to have time to bother about them, or to attempt in my interest to make their acquaintance. In the evenings he was more free, and continued to take me constantly to Rivebel. There are, in those restaurants, as there are in public gardens and railway trains, people embodied in a quite ordinary appearance, whose name astonishes us, when having happened to ask it, we discover that this is not the mere inoffensive stranger whom we supposed, but nothing less than the minister or duke of whom we have so often heard. 2 or 3 times already in the Rivebel restaurant we had, St. Luc and I, seen come in and sit down at a table when everyone else was getting ready to go, a man of large stature, very muscular, with regular features and a grizzled beard, gazing with concentrated attention into the empty air. One evening, on our asking the landlord who was this obscure, solitary, and belated diner, "What?" he exclaimed. "Do you mean to say you don't know the famous painter Elster?" Swann had once mentioned his name to me. I had entirely forgotten in what connection, but the omission of a particular memory, like that part of a sentence when we are reading, leads sometimes not to uncertainty, but to a birth of certainty that is premature. "He is a friend of Swann, a very well-known artist, extremely good," I told St. Luc. Whereupon there passed over us both, like a wave of emotion, the thought that Elster was a great artist, a celebrated man, and that, confounding us with the rest of the diners, he had no suspicion of the ecstasy into which we were thrown by the idea of his talent. Doubtless his unconsciousness of our admiration and of our acquaintance with Swann would not have troubled us had we not been at the seaside. But since we were still at an age when enthusiasm cannot keep silence, and had been transported into a life in which not to be known is unendurable, we wrote a letter, signed with both our names, in which we revealed to Elster, in the 2 diners seated within a few feet of him, 2 passionate admirers of his talent, 2 friends of his great friend Swann, and asked to be allowed to pay our homage to him in person. A waiter undertook to convey this missive to the celebrity. A celebrity Elster was, perhaps, not yet at this period quite to the extent claimed by the landlord, though he was to reach the height of his fame within a very few years. But he had been one of the first to frequent this restaurant when it was still only a sort of farmhouse, and had brought to it a whole colony of artists, who had all, as it happened, migrated elsewhere as soon as the farmyard in which they used to feed in the open air, under a lean-to roof, had become a fashionable centre. Elster himself had returned to Rivebel this evening only on account of a temporary absence of his wife from the house which he had taken in the neighbourhood. But great talent, even when its existence is not yet recognized, will inevitably provoke certain phenomena of admiration, such as the landlord had managed to detect in the questions asked by more than one English lady visitor, a thirst for information as to the life led by Elster, or in the number of letters that he received from abroad. Then the landlord had further remarked that Elster did not like to be disturbed when he was working, that he would rise in the middle of the night and take a little model down to the water's edge to pose for him, nude if the moon was shining, and had told himself that so much labor was not in vain, nor the admiration of the tourist unjustified, when he had, in one of Elster's pictures, recognized a wooden cross which stood by the roadside as you came into Rivebel. "It's all right," he would repeat with stupefaction. "There are all the 4 beams. Oh, he does take a lot of trouble." And he did not know whether a little sunrise over the sea which Elster had given him might not be worth a fortune. We watched him read our letter, put it in his pocket, finish his dinner, begin to ask for his things, get up to go, and we were so convinced that we had shocked him by our overture that we would now have hoped, as keenly as at first we had dreaded, to make our escape without his noticing us. We did not bear in mind for a single instant a consideration which should, nevertheless, have seemed to us most important, namely, that our enthusiasm for Elster, on the sincerity of which we should not have allowed the least doubt to be cast, which we could indeed have supported with the evidence of our breathing arrested by expectancy, our desire to do no matter what that was difficult or heroic for the great man, was not, as we imagined it to be, admiration, since neither of us had ever seen anything that he had painted. Our feeling might have as its object the hollow idea of a great artist, but not a body of work which was unknown to us. It was, at the most, admiration in the abstract, the nervous envelope, the sentimental structure of an admiration without content. That is to say, a thing as indissolubly attached to boyhood as are certain organs which have ceased to exist in the adult man. We were still boys. Elster, meanwhile, was reaching the door when suddenly he turned and came towards us. I was transported by a delicious thrill of terror, such as I could not have felt a few years later, because while age diminishes our capacity, familiarity with the world has meanwhile destroyed in us any inclination to provoke such strange encounters, to feel that kind of emotion. In the course of the few words that Elster had come back to say to us, sitting down at our table, he never gave any answer on the several occasions on which I spoke to him of Swann. I began to think that he did not know him. He asked me, nevertheless, to come and see him at his Balbec studio, an invitation which he did not extend to Saint Loup, and which I had earned, as I might not, perhaps from Swann's recommendation, had Elster been intimate with him, for the part played by disinterested motives is greater than we are inclined to think in peopled lives, by a few words which made him think that I was devoted to the arts. He lavished on me a friendliness which was as far above that of Saint Loup as that was above the affability of a mere tradesman. Compared with that of a great artist, the friendliness of a great gentleman, charming as it may be, has the effect of an actor's playing a part, of being feigned. Saint Loup sought to please. Elster loved to give himself. Everything that he possessed, ideas, work, and the rest which he counted for far less, he would have given gladly to anyone who could understand him. But failing society that was endurable, he lived in an isolation, with a savagery which fashionable people called pose and ill-breeding, public authorities a recalcitrant spirit, his neighbors madness, his family selfishness and pride. And no doubt at first he had thought, even in his solitude, with enjoyment that, thanks to his work, he was addressing, in spite of distance, he was giving a loftier idea of himself to those who had misunderstood or hurt him. Perhaps in those days he lived alone not from indifference, but from love of his fellows, and just as I had renounced the Gilbert to appear to her again one day in more attractive colors, dedicated his work to certain people as a way of approaching them again, by which, without actually seeing him, they would be made to love him, admire him, talk about him. A renunciation is not always complete from the start, when we decide upon it in our original frame of mind and before it has reacted upon us, whether it be the renunciation of an invalid, a monk, an artist, or a hero. But if he had wished to produce with certain people in his mind, in producing he had lived for himself, remote from the society to which he had become indifferent. The practice of solitude had given him a love for it, as happens with every big thing which we have begun by fearing, because we knew it to be incompatible with smaller things to which we clung, and of which it does not so much deprive us as it detaches us from them. Before we experience it, our whole preoccupation is to know to what extent we can reconcile it with certain pleasures which cease to be pleasures as soon as we have experienced it. End of section 37.